Tonight at 10, after a rocky party conference, Liz Truss says she does have what it takes to lead the UK through stormy days. After a conference marked by division and argument, she pledged to deliver on promises to cut taxes and to reduce regulations on business.
Whenever there's change, there is disruption. And not everybody will be in favour of change, but everyone will benefit from the result. A growing economy and a better future.
The speech was briefly interrupted by environmental protesters asking who'd voted for Liz Truss's policies. We'll have reaction to the speech inside and outside the hall, and we'll be looking at the economic challenges ahead. Also tonight, in Iran, schoolgirls have now joined the growing protests against the hardline laws restricting women's rights.
Bad news, eh? The dream's over, bro.
Staff at Worcester Warriors rugby club react to the news that they're losing their jobs as the club faces going out of business. And we meet the British woman who, after 30 years in Hollywood, is one of the most powerful figures in the world of entertainment.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, it takes Erling Haaland less than 7 minutes to score again for Manchester City as they look to win 3 out of 3 in their Champions League group.
Good evening. In her first party conference speech as Conservative leader and Prime Minister, Liz Truss has insisted she has the right approach to take the UK through stormy days, in her words. After a conference marked by division and argument, she admitted her policies would cause disruption and that times were tough for many people. There were no new policy announcements in the speech. The Prime Minister pledged to deliver on promises to cut taxes and to reduce the regulations on business. Our political editor, Chris Mason, has this report.
Not everyone here has been standing up for the Prime Minister in the last few days, but they did today. Moving on up, Liz Truss hopes, she began with the themes that shape us.
We gather at a vital time for the United Kingdom. These are stormy days. We're dealing with the global economic crisis caused by COVID and by Putin's appalling war in Ukraine.
A Prime Minister unknown to many, still introducing herself to the country and explaining what drives her.
I remember as a young girl being presented on a plane with a junior air hostess badge. Meanwhile, my brothers were given junior pilot badges. It made me angry and it made me determined.
From the personal to the political and her core objective.
And for too long, the political debate has been dominated by the argument about how we distribute a limited economic pie. Instead, we need to grow the pie so that everyone gets a bigger slice. That is why I'm determined to take a new approach and break us out of this high-tax, low-growth cycle.
And listen to this, an acknowledgement not everyone will like what she's doing. It'll be bumpy, but worth it.
Whenever there's change, there is disruption. And not everybody will be in favour of change, but everyone will benefit from the result.
But this tax-cutting Prime Minister had to ditch a tax cut for the best paid, and there was contrition.
The fact is that the abolition of the 45p tax rate became a distraction from the major parts of our growth plan. That is why we're no longer proceeding with it. I get it, and I have listened.
The Prime Minister at first appeared nervous, but what happened next appeared to galvanise her.
To act.
Environmental activists questioned the legitimacy of a Prime Minister who hasn't won an election. It was a moment that didn't wrong-foot her, but helped to define who she's against, with a catch-all label she'll hope will stick.
I will not allow the anti-growth coalition to hold us back. Labour, the Lib Dems, the SNP, the militant unions, the vested interests dressed up as think tanks, the talking heads, the Brexit deniers, Extinction Rebellion, and some of the people we had in the hall earlier. They peddle the same old answers. It's always more taxes, more regulation, and more meddling. Wrong, wrong, wrong.
This is a Prime Minister plotting a very different course from Boris Johnson. But on one issue, there is continuity.
We did not stand up to Russia early enough. We will make sure this never happens again. We will stand with our Ukrainian friends, however long it takes. Ukraine can win, Ukraine must win, and Ukraine will win.
Just as the protesters united this audience, this did too. But behind the applause, gloom from many about this party's future, its leader, its direction, and so a concluding plea.
We must stay the course. Together, we can unleash the full potential of our great country. That is how we will build a new Britain for a new era.
After days of indiscipline within government and near mutiny beyond it, Liz Truss and her team are glad this is over.
That was the speech of a Prime Minister trying to hold her party together. Have you done enough, Prime Minister? This has been a conference defined by dysfunction, disagreement, even open civil war. I know that sounds like an exaggeration. It really isn't.
In the moments afterwards, though, relief here and warm words.
I thought that was great. That's great. That's what we needed, was the vision. She's put the signal up. We want everyone to get involved. This is what the country needs.
I thought that speech was exactly what we want to present the country, clear conservatism.
It's been an upbeat conference full of energy.
Energy, that's what you call it?
Absolutely. We've got the ideas, we've got the fizz, we've got the debate here. This is where it's happening.
As for the Prime Minister, she couldn't leave quickly enough. She can run away from this conference, but not the immense challenges she confronts. Chris Mason, BBC News, in Birmingham.
Well, the Prime Minister was addressing supporters and some critics in the hall in Birmingham. There was a wider message, of course, to voters at large. High Peak in Derbyshire returned a Conservative MP in 2019, but with a very small majority. Our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth, has been talking to voters and business owners there.
After a rocky start, an attempt to get back on track, and the view of voters is key. In the Peak District, this village wool shop is run by Karen.
People are starting to buy yarn to make blankets because they're worried about the energy.
She says things have picked up since help with energy bills was announced. A Conservative voter last time round, she's prepared to see how things unravel for the new Prime Minister.
I think she's trying to kickstart the economy, and I think she's got the right idea. I didn't agree with lowering the 45p high rate of income tax. And I'm glad she's listened to people and changed her mind.
But for some, things feel a bit more bleak. The market town of Glossop's been home to this butcher's for 100 years. John's had to adapt in the current economic climate, even closing his local abattoir, and he's not convinced government rhetoric yet matches reality.
What do you think when you hear Liz Truss talk about growth?
Growth comes from having a stable environment where it's clear what's happening. We haven't got U-turns happening. Obviously, we've got the corporation tax allowance, but if you're not making any money, that's not much use to you, is it? And I don't think that the environment is conducive to growth from a small business like us.
This constituency is often a symbol of the wider political mood, changing colour with the national picture. It narrowly turned Conservative last time. The test will be whether the new Prime Minister can command similar support.
These are stormy days.
Watching her speech, Kathy, who runs Glossop Business Network, and accountant Catherine was sceptical.
So we've had a cut in tax, which is positive for everyone that's struggling at the moment, but how that is funded by us as a country, it has a knock-on effect somewhere. It's just where that has a knock-on effect.
I'm not convinced she's got the right priorities. They're too much into trickle-down, and I don't think trickle-down will work. The people on the lower, and probably a lot of people on middle incomes, are struggling.
And on Liz Truss herself?
I think she needs to start doing her homework, and she needs to think before she opens her mouth.
Yeah, she's very optimistic about the future and what she can do. But I think we need to wait the time and see if what she hopes will happen does actually happen.
Many will be waiting to see the shape of things to come, which will of course determine how this political landscape looks down the line. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, High Peak.
Let's consider a little more. In a moment, we'll talk to Chris Mason, about the political impact of the speech. First, our economics editor, Faisal Islam, to spell out the economic challenges coming up. Faisal?
Yes, thanks, Huw. Growth now provides its own metric by which to judge the effectiveness of the entire Truss government after that conference speech. But there are more immediate challenges. Some of the aftershocks of the financial turbulence after the mini-budget are only now reaching the real economy. That can be seen especially in the mortgage market, which normally moves with the Bank of England base rate. But look at this chart of the typical 2-year fixed-rate mortgage that's taken off since the mini-budget, reaching over 6%, the highest level since the financial crisis. And that's a significant rise, several hundred or even a few £1,000s a year, depending on the size of the mortgage. The government argue that most of the rise is other factors, but this very sharp bit here, well, that's what we've seen since the mini-budget. What's at the heart of all this turmoil in the first place? Borrowing costs for government, which feed into those mortgage rates. This is the rollercoaster on the effective borrowing rate for a 5-year loan to government. You'll see it's calmed down a little over the past few days, but it has actually crept up a little over the past 24 hours. But it's still fundamentally higher than it was before the mini-budget, and you can see that on the day of the mini-budget on the 23rd of September. Now, some of these trends are seen in other economies, but not to this extent. The markets are still awaiting firm, costed, hard numbers from the government. But here's the big challenge. The Truss economic agenda is that you get growth from tax cuts, planning reform, energy investments and more. The challenge is this. All those take not just lots of time, but a lot of political capital, as we've seen. And Trussonomics may only have limited quantities of both. Huw.
Faisal, many thanks. Faisal Islam there, our economics editor. And Chris, who of course was in Birmingham on those rather interesting days there, the Conservative Party conference. Where does this leave the Prime Minister, Chris, when we look at the mini-budget and the difficulties around that, and then of course the U-turn on that prominent policy, a rather divisive party conference in some ways? Where does she stand?
It was divisive. It was dangerous, I think, for the Conservatives politically. Why? Because there was indiscipline within the government. There was near mutiny amongst Conservative backbenchers, prompted initially, as you say, by that row about tax for the highest paid. And the danger for the Prime Minister of that U-turn was that it was crushing for her authority. And yes, that might be my analysis, but it's also the analysis of senior figures in government. They acknowledge how dangerous that was because they feared it would tempt backbenchers and others to embark on other expeditions to try and change her mind. And of course, we saw that within hours with this unresolved row around benefits payments, with indiscipline in the Cabinet, some suggesting that Cabinet Minister Penny Mordaunt ought to be sacked for taking a position that was different from the government's position, and backbenchers making argument again that the government should move and change its view. When you speak to people at the top of government, they are very, very nervous about the last couple of days. They feel that their party, in the words of one, is an ungovernable rabble, that they are fatalistic about election defeat and therefore are willing to rock the boat. The one thing they cling to, senior figures in government, is that the alternative would be worse. In other words, if MPs were try to topple Theresa May or prompt another general election, the danger is for them that they go down to a big, big defeat. But it tells you a lot that it's that crutch they have to lean on to feel even vaguely positive.
And just a final point then, Chris, on Liz Truss, which is to do with how you think she is coping, your reading of the way that she approached that big speech today with a lot of pressure, given what's been going on. What's your reading of how she's handling it?
She's been Prime Minister, we should remember, for just over 4 weeks, an extraordinarily short period of time, but one where a huge amount has happened, not least, of course, the death of the Queen. I think in reality what we had in that speech today, Huw, was her reintroducing herself to the country. Here is a Prime Minister who, yes, has been a minister for a very long time, but isn't particularly widely known in the country, considering she is the Prime Minister. They didn't want to introduce any new policies in this speech. As I think I said to you last night, once bitten, twice shy on that one, given the last couple of days. And so instead, doing the biographical thing, who she is, what she stands for, and the roots, if you like, her history and what led her to her political philosophy. So they'll hope that helps with that introduction. They'll also hope things are a lot more steady next week.
OK, Chris, many thanks again. Chris Mason there, our political editor. By the way, more information on all of that, analysis from Chris and colleagues on BBC News Online, bbc.co.uk/news, not just on the website, of course, but you can access that on your mobile devices and via the BBC News app. Let's turn to events in Iran, because protests against the government have entered their third week following the death of a 22-year-old woman in police custody. Schoolgirls and students have been defying the country's strict laws on wearing head coverings after Mahsa Amini was detained for not wearing her hijab correctly. Her family alleged that she was beaten by officers in the country's morality police. BBC Persian's Rana Rahimpur has this story.
This was Nikah Shah Karami, a typical shy teenager seen here singing karaoke with friends. She was killed by Iran's security forces a few days before her 17th birthday. She was one of thousands of teenagers protesting against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Opposition is growing. Even school children have joined the protests, including this 14-year-old girl.
A lot of teachers do agree with us, but they don't dare to say anything. Boys have not chanted any slogans yet, but they show their protests in some sort of ways, such as writing on the benches, walls, or distributing papers of slogans and collaborating with each other inside the school.
Pupils are burning the pictures of the leader of the Islamic Revolution, chasing away pro-government school officials, and showing their middle finger to the ideology that has oppressed them for years. It all started 3 weeks ago with the death of this woman, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. She died in the custody of the notorious morality police. She was accused of not wearing the hijab properly. With restrictions on reporting on the ground, videos shared online are vital evidence in understanding how things are unfolding. The BBC and independent media are not allowed to report from Iran. But journalists here across BBC Persian and BBC Monitoring have been gathering videos from social media and speaking to witnesses tracking where protests broke out in the first few weeks. By using landmarks, the team can pinpoint the location of the protests. We've analysed more than 1,000 videos verifying at least 300 protests since Amini's death. The protests have continued despite Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's warning on Monday that they were riots orchestrated by the West. His warning hasn't scared these young girls who no longer want to see his face in their classrooms. Instead, they wrote their dreams behind his framed picture, equality and freedom, to turn this page of Iran's history. Rana Rahimpur, BBC News.
Now, in Russia, President Putin says he expects the situation to stabilise in the 4 regions that he says have been annexed from Ukraine. Now, the 4 regions in question are these. They are Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhia and Kherson. And President Putin's forces are in control of the areas in pink here. And Ukraine says it's regaining ground in the east, those areas shown in purple, with a governor on the ground telling the BBC that they've retaken 6 more villages in the Luhansk region since yesterday. There's also been a significant breakthrough for Ukrainian troops in the south near Kherson, with President Zelensky saying that there have been fast, powerful movements, he said, in the purple zone, with dozens of settlements liberated, according to their forces, this week alone. Let's talk to our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, who's in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. John, how do you assess morale there now?
Well, as you say, there's every day new stories about villages, towns being recaptured by the Ukrainian troops. This is not an excitable kind of place, Huw. People aren't going around the streets shouting and cheering, but they are quietly pleased with what's going on. And now the Americans are starting to say maybe if the Ukrainians can recapture the city of Kherson in the south, maybe they'll be able to capture the whole Crimean Peninsula. This comes only a matter of a few weeks, really, since the Americans and Europeans were saying to President Zelensky here, you've got to be really careful, you've got to do a deal, you've got to be realistic, you can't win. And we saw the richest man on earth, Elon Musk, only just a day or so ago, talking about giving up Crimea permanently to Russia, which infuriated them here. The problem that President Zelensky has is that he mustn't allow people to start feeling that it's a walkover, that the Russians are hopeless, they're bound to win. He's got to keep the support of the West, both in arms terms and in finance terms.
John, many thanks. John Simpson with the latest analysis there for us in Kyiv. A look at some other stories today. A 14-year-old boy who was stabbed and killed in Gateshead has been named by police. Tomas Olejak died in the early hours of Tuesday morning after being injured on Monday night. A 14-year-old boy arrested on suspicion of murder remains in custody, as does a 13-year-old girl who is being held on suspicion of assisting an offender. Now, there have been renewed calls today for more aid to help the victims of drought in Somalia, following our special report on the situation last night. Hundreds of thousands of people are facing starvation after the worst drought in 40 years. Now, the Republic of Somalia in the east of Africa and the Horn of Africa there has a long history of droughts, but there have been more and more recently driven by climate change, and many people have been forced from their homes. Those that remain are cut off from potential help because of a long-running insurgency by Islamist forces. And getting aid to them is difficult because of the Al-Shabaab militants. They control parts of the country, parts here which are dotted in black. They are in control, and from there they regularly launch attacks. Now, the whole country is affected, but it's the areas in brown controlled by militants. It's really principally these areas here where people are suffering most as the famine looms. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding has been working on these reports for months, and the threat from militants meant that he could only reach the city of Baidoa by flying there.
The parched plains of southern Somalia and the heart of what could soon be declared a famine. We've come to the dusty city of Baidoa, in a region plagued for years by conflict and now by the worst drought in 4 decades. In the main hospital, severely malnourished children in every bed. Some fighting for breath. This crisis has been years in the making, and yet it feels like a distracted world has been caught off guard.
We need more supplies. We need more actors on the ground and people moving around to provide support to the population.
Or localised famine will turn into something much bigger.
Definitely.
On the outskirts of Baidoa, hundreds of thousands of people have already gathered in search of food. 50-year-old Habiba Mohamud is building a shelter for her family. There's nothing left on our farm, she says. There's no reason to go back there. Climate change is to blame for much of this, but there are other factors. As you can't fail to notice, most of the adults here and around these camps are women. And that's because of Somalia's conflict, which has ground on for 3 decades or so in one form or another. And indeed, the front lines, such as they are about 4 kilometres away from where we are now. This footage shows Somali government forces advancing further north, seizing territory from a formidable Islamist militant group, Al-Shabaab. But in much of the countryside, communities remain trapped by the conflict, unable to receive aid. 2-year-old Naima has made it to safety in Baidoa and is finally getting help. But her mother, too afraid to reveal her identity, told us that her relatives at home had just called to say they were now in hiding after more fighting broke out in their village. And so a fragile nation grapples with climate change and drought against a backdrop of unending conflict. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Baidoa, Somalia.
Worcester Warriors Rugby Club has been at the heart of the city and the community for 150 years. But today, players and staff at the club learned that their contracts are being terminated. It follows a High Court hearing which wound up part of the troubled Premiership side, which has been suspended from the league. HMRC has been pursuing Worcester for a £6 million unpaid tax bill, and the court ordered that the company which pays the salary should be liquidated. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has been following the story.
And here are the history makers. Just 5 months ago, Worcester Warriors were celebrating winning the Premiership Cup, one of the greatest days in the club's long history. But today, surely it's worst.
Bad news, eh? The dream's over, bro.
Shell-shocked players exchanging farewells this morning just minutes after learning they and hundreds of staff had lost their jobs after part of the stricken club was wound up.
Mate, I'm devastated. I'm absolutely devastated. I can't believe it's got to this point.
Forward Joe Batley telling me of the toll this had taken.
I've had a tough phone call with my partner, explaining our worst fears have come true. Seeing the boys' faces today has been super emotional. It's the heartbeat of the city almost. It's got the foundation, which do amazing work around the city. It's got the community side that do a lot with the kids and schools. The overriding feeling is devastation, really.
The first Premiership team to go into administration for 23 years, Worcester has debts of £25 million, including £14 million to the government in the form of a COVID loan.
I'm Collins, my business partner Jason, and we're the owners of the Warriors.
Co-owners Jason Whittingham and Colin Goldring now deeply unpopular with players and fans over their management. The plight of Worcester Warriors has left fans, players, the staff and the wider community in shock, but it's also reinforced mounting concerns over professional club rugby unions' finances, governance and sustainability. And it's not the only club in difficulties. One of rugby's biggest names, Wasps, also being pursued by HMRC over unpaid tax and on the brink of administration themselves.
They are loss-making institutions. They are often propped up by wealthy benefactors who are willing to foot the bill, but that's not a model of self-sustainability. What the pandemic has done is kind of shine a bigger light on that, and it's accelerated the situation.
After their final training session together, these players now face an uncertain future, and the game's authorities must tackle a mounting crisis. Dan Rowan, BBC News, Worcester.
Well, let's turn to a story of universal success, because Donna Langley is one of the most powerful women in Hollywood, the first British woman to run a major American film studio, and she's been behind some of Hollywood's biggest films. It's a remarkable story for a woman who grew up on the Isle of Wight and arrived in LA 30 years ago. Our culture editor, Katie Razzle, has been to meet her.
The back lot at the oldest surviving movie studio in America. And I'm taking a ride, LA style, with one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. Donna Langley's the boss here at Universal and the first British woman ever to head a US film studio.
I'm a Brit, I'm English. I love my Marmite sandwiches and a good packet of crisps.
This is the biggest day of my life! Langley's turned Universal's fortunes around with lucrative franchises like Despicable Me, Jurassic World and Fast and Furious.
No matter how fast you are.
You're listening to Compton's very own.
She championed movies like Straight Outta Compton for audiences Hollywood used to ignore. Mamma Mia! And famously backed Mamma Mia when colleagues weren't keen. Now she's planning something truly out of this world.
Are you taking Tom Cruise to space?
I think Tom Cruise is taking us to space. We have a great project in development with Tom that does contemplate him doing just that. Yeah, taking a rocket up to the space station and shooting and hopefully being the first civilian to do a spacewalk outside of the space station.
The Hollywood signs just had a lick of paint. As the movie industry this city was built on is going through huge transformation. The pandemic, the cost of living crisis and the rise of the streaming platforms means for the average movie lover, there's no place like home.
I think we can enjoy things at home on streaming, of course, but in order to make movies matter, to create movie stars and to create, directors and careers, it really does need that theatrical experience.
The power to destroy themselves. Langley's wooed big-name directors like Christopher Nolan. His new film Oppenheimer will be released by Universal. Steven Spielberg too is back at the studio where he made E.T.
Back to the Future was filmed here? Back to the Future, To Kill a Mockingbird.
It's all a long way from the Isle of Wight, where Langley, whose biological father was Egyptian, was adopted and grew up. Back then, you probably weren't seeing, yourself reflected back in many of the people on the island.
No, I was, I think what they would describe me as exotic, and it gave me a great sense of independence, and, I was bullied a little bit in school as well, and so I had to really tough it out.
My tour guide is now Dame Donna, for services to film and entertainment, a Brit who's redefining show business on Earth and perhaps even in space. Katie Razzle, BBC News, Los Angeles.
And you can hear the full interview with Donna Langley. That's on The Media Show, and it's available for you in the BBC Sounds app. Now, the time has just turned 10:30. Let's catch up with the weather, and here's Nick. Hi, Nick.
Huw, a rainbow, in fact, a double rainbow end to the day. After the rain cleared, the sun appeared. Still those heavy showers around, though. We've seen quite a few of those continuing into this evening. Quite a lot of rain so far this week in Western Scotland, over 100 millimetres in places. But there, the rain cleared today, and though the showers are continuing across parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, though those in northwest England are going to fade away for many places overnight. Dry, clear, still quite blustery, much cooler than it was last night. You'll notice that in the morning, temperatures 5 to 10 degrees down across parts of Wales and England, though there will be a lot of sunshine to begin the day. Still, though, in Scotland, some showers around, parts of Northern Ireland too, and you will notice here there is a zone of thicker cloud that will run in through North Wales, through the Midlands and on towards Northern England. That will have some showery rain. South of that, you'll stay mainly dry, certainly through East Anglia, South East England, and there'll be parts of Eastern Scotland that will stay dry as well until quite late on. It's Western Scotland will be turning much wetter by the end of the afternoon. Some of that rain spreading through the central belt too. Average wind speeds, gusts are higher across northern areas, 40 to maybe 50 miles per hour. But if you're out of the wind, in some of that sunshine, there's still some warmth to be had, especially with these temperatures through the eastern side of England. Now, as we go on through tomorrow evening, it's Scotland that will be turning more widely wetter again, and some of that rain heads into Northern Ireland overnight. And then through Friday, that moves south with squally winds, not reaching southeastern parts until after dark. Ahead and behind, there'll be showers to be had, blustery showers with some sunny spells towards the northwest. There's a lull. Showers and wind on Saturday before further rain running in towards northern and western areas on Sunday. And make no mistake, next week is still looking very autumnal, but Huw, still no sign of anything significantly colder on the horizon.
OK, we've been warned. Nick, thanks very much. Nick Miller there for us. That's BBC News at 10 on Wednesday, the 5th of October. So don't forget, more analysis of the day's main stories, including the speech by the Prime Minister in Birmingham. That's Newsnight, and it's with Victoria. They're just going on air right now. Here on BBC One, the news continues. All of my colleagues in the nations and regions standing by with the news wherever you are tonight. But from all of us on the 10 team, thanks for watching and good night.